Hello, welcome everybody. We're very lucky to have three excellent and well-informed speakers today for today's webinar. We've got Gordon Hickman from Defra, head of exotic disease policy, talking to us about the preparing for the high-risk period and any testing that we might be getting. Then we've got Marion England from Pirbright, who's going to be talking about the high-risk period and explaining a bit about sort of how the midges seasonality and the surveillance that they're doing. And then we've got Evelyn de Strijker from the Netherlands, who's going to be telling us a bit about the vaccination programs that are going on over there and a little bit in Germany. So I'll pass on to Gordon, who will take on from here.
Good morning, everyone. We can just have my slides. Anyway, good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me back. This is really just a very short update. I suppose the good thing is very little has changed since I gave the last update and a more fulsome presentation about our proposed disease control strategies about a month ago. I think it was the 12th of June. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, and I've sort of called it now the 2022-23 season, as opposed to the 24-25 season, which we hope we don't get, but if we do, we'll consider it to be a new sort of Midge season. That kicked off on the 10th of November. Obviously, colleagues in the Netherlands were a few weeks ahead of us. Overall, we had 126 infected animals. You know these numbers, but 119 of them were cattle, 7 were sheep, on 73 different premises and 56 different keepers. Now, interestingly, unlike the Dutch situation, all of ours were detected by surveillance because none of ours showed clinical signs. Obviously, we don't know if we get an incursion this year, whether that will also be the case. And I'm sure Evelyn can update us on the position in the Netherlands now, but I believe you have had a couple of cases this year already in unvaccinated animals. The control we put in place last year was to put those 2 temporary control zones in. Those have now been lifted, so we don't have any disease control zones. But as you know, because we lost our country-free status, we're unable to export animals because we don't have an approved or authorized vaccine. And we can't sign the certificates otherwise. So we've still got no evidence of circulation in the UK midge population, but as Marion will tell you, the temperatures are now warm enough for onward spread if we were to get an incursion. And I think, again, Marion's going to talk about how we're doing the predictions and the surveillance, not only in the midges, but also working with the Met Office. But as of last week, the risk of incursion from the continent was still low. If you're monitoring gov.uk, you'll note that we've also published some guidance on germinal product controls, and we're recommending that if you are collecting germinal products, particularly in the high-risk counties, you do consider taking samples, not necessarily analysing them, but to be able to demonstrate if a zone were to be put in place, that the animals that the donor animals were negative at the time of taking those samples, because we will be looking back 60 days from the start of the zone in terms of applying those zones. Next slide. So again, I set this out last time we met. We are still offering free testing in those high-risk counties. so Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent and East Sussex. So if you want to take advantage of that, you contact that number there, or UK Farm Care, and arrange for a vet to come and take the samples, and they'll be tested at Pirbright. The take up has been quite low, partly I guess because the risk has been low up to now, and partly I think people are just worried that we might pick up some historical infection. That should be, the risk of that should be decreasing, because it's now several months after the we believe the incursion took place. But the offer is still there, and we would encourage anyone that's moving animals out of those areas, particularly long distance, to get those animals tested. Next slide. So again, I went through this last time, but really our message to farmers and vets is to be vigilant, monitor the stock, know what those clinical signs are. There's a lot of sources of information, and the Ruminant Health and Welfare portal is an excellent place to get that information. Obviously, gov.uk is another source as well, and there's bits of information at Pirbright as well. Really urge people to be prepared. We've set out what our control are going to be. They are going to be, proportionate, but we are very likely to put in place zones, and we definitely put in place zones for new disease. So just be ready for that. Things like know where your abattoir is, and check whether it's designated or not, because we'll only allow animals to move from a zone to a designated abattoir. I think we're up to 35 now, so much better position. But if your abattoir isn't on there, firstly, encourage them to do so, and also just look at a backup if you sell direct. We're also really keen that you register all your land, including those temporary land parcels, etc., so that we can more easily track animals. And if you were to be affected, we can unrestrict parcels that are some distance away. And I guess source responsibly, whether that be importing or from the UK. So if you're sourcing from one of those high-risk counties, maybe ask for those animals to be tested. And I think that's really an update from me. We still don't have approved or authorised vaccines. Obviously, we've just got some new ministers, and we'll be talking to them in the coming weeks. But I think, Joe, that's really my update.
Thanks very much, Gordon. That's helpful, and yeah, especially abattoir capacity needs to be sort of forefront of our minds, really. I think.
Yeah, we've got fairly good representation from cattle slaughterhouses, so we're probably 65% of England and Wales capacity, but we're probably only got 30% of the sheep capacity. So particularly sheep producers, just check that one out.
Yeah, give their abattoirs a little nudge, perhaps. Right, great. Should have said we're going to have questions at the end, actually, but so sort of start thinking about them, and you can put them on in the chat there at the side. Right, we're going to have Dr. Marion England just now from Pirbright, who's going to be telling us all about the high risk and the midges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you let me when you can see my screen, all right?
Yep, I can see. It's not in presentation mode, but I can see it anyway. Like it's not. Is
it not? Okay.
It's not on the actual slides.
Okay. Right, hold on a second then. Let me try something else. in presentation mode.
There we go.
Perfect.
Good.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Right. So yes, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the risk of Bluetongue virus, because as we've now entered the higher risk period. So just a reminder that Bluetongue is transmitted by Culicoides biting midges. So these are tiny blood-feeding insects, 2 to 4 millimeters long. In the UK, we have about 6 species that are able to transmit Bluetongue virus. They're highly abundant, and the females require a blood meal to produce eggs, and that's how they have a role in vector-borne disease transmission. So just to run through the life cycle of the midge. So the adult female will mate, and then she will look for a blood meal. So that's when she'll bite a cow or a sheep. And then she digests that blood meal and uses the protein from the blood meal to mature her eggs. And then she'll find a habitat that's suitable and she will lay her eggs. They will then develop into larvae, hatch out into larvae, which go through 4 different stages. Then the larvae pupate, and then the adults emerge some time later. So that's the life cycle. Thinking about the actual Bluetongue transmission cycle, so after an uninfected midge has bitten an infective host, so this is on the left of your diagram, the virus then has to replicate within the midge, and this is dependent, the rate that this happens is dependent on temperature. So the speed of this process is dependent on temperature. And what happens is the virus will replicate within the midge and then move to the salivary glands. And that process is called the extrinsic incubation period, or the EIP. And depending on temperature, it can take usually between 4 and 20 days when the temperatures are suitable. And once the virus has disseminated through the whole of the midge and reached the salivary glands, if that midge goes and bites a susceptible host, it will transmit the virus. And then viremia takes about 2 to 4 days to develop. So the extrinsic incubation period, Culicoides is a biological vector, so this replication of the virus needs to take place, and the virus needs to move from the gut to the salivary glands in order for the midge to be able to transmit the virus. So it's not like a sort of dirty needle approach where which is mechanical transmission, which is slightly different. So this replication process needs to happen. So the extrinsic incubation period, so the EIP, is the time taken for the virus to replicate within the midge and move to the salivary glands. So that time is dependent on the strain of the virus, the vector species, and the temperature. So as temperature increases, the EIP takes less time, so the virus can be transmitted faster. So EIP is directly related to temperature, and it's a function of virus replication. The temperature that's required for this to take place is around 12 to 15 degrees. So midges are active anywhere from 4 degrees upwards in the UK, but the virus won't actually be able to be transmitted until the temperatures are consistently at 12 degrees or above. So that's why we have this sort of lag period between the start of activity of the midges and actually the start of when transmission can occur. Once Culicoides are infected, they are infected for life, but there's no evidence that they can pass the virus to their offspring. So a midge will become infected as an adult, but then it won't be able to pass the virus through to its offspring. So we can model the duration of EIP using temperatures from around the UK. So we can look at how long it will take for the EIP to complete at different times of the year. So to give you an idea, at 20 degrees, an average daily temperature of 20 degrees, this is across a 24-hour period, it takes around 5 days for the EIP to complete. So until recently, this has not been the case. So essentially, if we're looking at a 5-day period, after 1 day, we can say that we're a fifth of the way through the EIP. Sorry, I think go. So we're a fifth of the way through. So essentially we need this process to be cumulative to get to the point where the virus is fully replicated and disseminated. So if the temperature drops, it will slow down. If the temperature increases, then the replication rate and the EIP, so the replication rate will increase and the EIP will shorten. So what we look for from the 1st of January, we've been looking at temperatures across different places in the UK. So in this bottom right-hand plot, you can see all the little circles of weather monitoring stations. And at 12 degrees, an average daily temperature of 12 degrees, we need 50 consecutive days, or to be accurate, 50.7 consecutive days in order for the Midge to complete the EIP. That's how long it takes at roughly 12 degrees. So what we've been looking at is how many cumulative days we've had in the UK since the 1st of January until we're getting 50 days that are above the replication threshold. So we're starting to see some areas go over that 50 days in the UK. So we're now, this was on the 20th of June, this plot. We're now pretty much all everywhere in the UK around that sort of high risk area is now above that required 50 days of suitable temperatures. And this relationship is exponential. So as the temperature increases, the EIP shortens quite dramatically. Okay, so that's sort of explaining why we're now in that higher risk period, because we've got those cumulative temperatures going on for a time that is appropriate for survival of the Midge, and also that the virus is able to complete that movement to the salivary glands. So just to give you another update on the risk assessments that we conduct on a weekly basis. So we look at the risk of windborne incursion from the continent into our high-risk counties on a weekly basis. So this is risk assessed by Pirbright, the Met Office, and APHA. So we use a model called the NAME model, which predicts wind incursion events over the last week. So it looks at what the prevailing winds have been over the previous week. And we have set areas along the coast of the continent. So you can see in the bottom right diagram, we've got source 1, source 2, source 3, all the way around from France through to Denmark. And we look at those specific points along the coast and whether the wind has been in the right direction for midges to have been blown over. So then we end up plotting these plumes, and we can see these plumes coming over from the continent and whether they're hitting our high-risk counties or not. So in the bottom right plot, you can see some plumes from Belgium are coming into Kent, and from the Netherlands, we're getting some plumes coming into East Anglia. This is not a current plot, this is just an example, so please don't take this as what's happened over the last week. And to give you an example of what we do with that, so in the bottom left diagram, we then look at the number of days that plumes came over and hit those coastal areas. So in the plot on the left, we can see that there's a 1 in Kent and East Sussex. So we know that on one day, there was, so one day after the previous 7, plumes were coming over and hitting those areas. So potentially we could have some midges being blown over. Okay, so as I say, this is risk assessed weekly, and the information that we use to do this is looking at the disease situation on the continent. So have there been reports of Bluetongue from those countries that we're interested in? So this is, so I'll just flip back one slide. So this is from Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and France, because those are all the sort of coastal areas that are closest to us. So we look at disease reports from these countries. So is it likely that disease has been circulating based on reports that have happened over the last week? Are the temperatures suitable for disease transmission in the source country? So is it likely that the virus is circulating within the midge population? And then we use this information to assess the risk of infected midges having been blown over from the continent. We also look at temperatures within the UK, so would onward transmission be possible if we were to have an incursion event? And as I mentioned, we now know that that is possible based on the temperatures that we've been experiencing. And we've been doing this kind of risk assessment for many years. So we've been doing it for many, many years, usually on a fortnightly basis, just in the seasonal active period for midges. But since we've had this incursion event in 2023, we've increased this to weekly. So just to be clear that this is not a forecasting tool, we retrospectively look back over the past week and see how likely it is that infected midges have flown in over the previous week. Okay, so just in summary, viral replication within the midge is driven by temperature and really closely linked with temperature. So temperature dictates the duration of the EIP. The higher the temperature, the shorter the EIP. And in the UK, temperatures are now suitable for EIP completion. If BTV re-emerged in the UK or we had an incursion event, onward transmission is now possible. And we monitor the risk of windborne incursion of infected midges each week. I think that's the end of my slideshow.
Great. Thanks very much, Marion. That was really interesting. Yeah, I think we'll before we do any questions, we'll go on to Evelyn, who will give us an update on these vaccines that have been used and the Bluetongue in Holland.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep.
We can see you. It's all good.
Right. So I've been asked to give an update on the situation in the Netherlands. So I heard that you were already informed about the clinical signs and how it presented in the Netherlands. So I skipped that part, but then I chose to show you some of the highlights after the research we did after the outbreak last year. My name is Evelien Dijkstra. I work at the Royal GD's. It's GD Animal Health. It's basically a private veterinary laboratory, but we also execute the national monitoring and surveillance systems. So after the outbreak, let's see. This was the situation we were left with in December 2023. We've got a massive outbreak with a lot of clinical signs and farmers reporting Bluetongue disease. Between May and December, not much happened, as we expect in a factor, a non-factor season. Although we got some notifications of farmers or veterinarians who were suspecting Bluetongue disease, but until then we tested PCR. Sometimes we tested PCR positive, but with really high CT values. That's the reason why we suspected that these were positive PCRs from an infection from 2023. So we we found that sheep and cattle can both be very PCR positive for a very long time. But of course, it's very difficult to determine when you actually have a new infection. You would expect lower CT values, but to be sure, you will have to see whether you can retain the live virus to see whether animals are still infected. But until May 2024, we didn't find any positive cases of Bluetongue or new positive cases of Bluetongue. So what we did in the meantime is to analyze what the actual impact was of Bluetongue after the last outbreak. And for sheep, we had almost 55,000 sheep that died, more than the average of a period of 5 years before. So it was a massive increase of mortality. There was no difference in mortality between lambs or sheep. so the mortality rates were high for both ages. What we did see is that the increase in mortality was very significant, especially in herds where the disease was notified. So you see in red the mortality rates after the first week of the detection of Bluetongue in week 38. We also saw an increase in mortality on farms that did not detect or notify the disease, but were located in a region where other farms did notify the disease. And we saw that there was a significant difference with regions we did not detect BTV. We also saw that farms that were already infected at the beginning of the outbreak, so they were infected during the whole vector season, so already infected in September, they were experiencing much higher mortality rates than farms that were that detected the disease or were infected later in the season. So we suspect that a certain amount of infection or the infection in the vector population also has an effect on the amount of infected animals and the increase in mortality. So what we observed in sheep is that we found a major increase in mortality, both sheep and lambs, and that the highest increase in mortality was in flocks that notified the disease or were located in infected regions. And the highest mortality was found in herds that notified the disease in September, and mostly associated with the months with higher temperatures, and that the presence of chilicoides was not a limiting factor. So in goats, we also found some detection of Bluetongue, but the mortality we saw some increase, but we couldn't really associate it with the presence of Bluetongue, and we had no increase in mortality in dairy kits. Then a short overview from what we saw in dairy cattle. We saw an increase in milk production, especially on infected herds, but also in herds that did not notify the disease, but were located in a region where other farms did notify the disease, compared to dairy herds that were located in a BTV-3 region. So as the figure says, that the BTV infected herds are the purple ones, and then the dairy herds that are in the free regions are the green lines. For mortality, we also saw an increase in mortality for dairy cattle, so over around 43,000 more cows died compared to the same period in previous years. And we also saw an increase in non-ear tagged cows. So in summary, we found that the impact of BT on dairy cattle, the highest impact was found on milk production and mortality of adult cattle, and a large variation was seen between herds. And the increase in premature births may have resulted in a higher non-ear tagged calf mortality. We don't know yet what the effect will be on the long term, so that was something we will monitor from now. And lameness and stiffness was the most frequent reported clinical sign on these farms that were infected with BT. We did a small clinical evaluation on 5 sheep farms and 5 cattle farms and 5 dairy goat farms. It's not really representative for the whole situation because these were farms that were infected early October, and that was the period the vector season was already limiting. So these farms were not the most infected farms. For dairy cattle, it's quite similar with what we found in the early outbreak regions. However, for sheep, this is well, it's represented for the region for the later infected farms. We also found farms that were infected in October where we experienced a morbidity of 100%. So in this case, it was only 15. But what's good to know is that we checked the sheep that farmers notified us as being ill or infected. And we found that around just 10% of these animals were able to survive and conquer the disease without any symptoms left. So around 75% died after being infected. And 15% did survive, but with major clinical signs and a high risk of being cold soon. Yeah, so different with cattle. So there was a slight mortality on these farms, but we also saw a lot of cattle that did recover after illness. So the high mortality is also visible when we did some sampling to detect the seroprevalence before and after infection, and the seroprevalence in sheep flocks was very low, and that's because there were almost no infected sheep left because the majority died, which is different from dairy cattle because most of the cows survived, so we could also detect the antibody titers. Of course, with a new outbreak season coming up, you want to know what the herd or the immunity is of your population for BT. So what we tried to do is we tested all bulk milk samples from all dairy cattle herds, which is around 30,000 herds in the Netherlands. And we sampled sheep flocks, around nearly 500 sheep flocks, to test for their seroprevalence. And these were the results. So based on a herd level prevalence, we saw these figures for dairy cattle and sheep, and this is corresponding with the outbreak we saw in the first figure, with the situation we left with after the outbreak in 2023. So this is similar to what we would have expected, but you could also see that major parts of the Netherlands are experiencing lower seroprevalence, and they're still naive to the infection of BT. The within herd flock prevalence in the sheep farms or cattle farms that were positive for antibodies. We saw higher prevalences for dairy cattle also in the region who experienced the most infections. And the sheep, the prevalence are still low, and that's just majority because of most infected sheep died. And based on the animal level prevalence, we saw that most of the animals were having a seroprevalence again in the expected areas, but the seroprevalence for sheep is very low. So for this year, we would expect to have a very naive population, and that in certain regions of the Netherlands, dairy cattle may have some immunity, but in the majority of the country, the population will still be naive. So this is in summary what we did. So we did what I just explained. We did first we detected whether there was already a seroprevalence detectable before the outbreak, so before August 2023. We did some pathology the clinical evaluation study, a preliminary impact analysis as just presented, and the zero prevalences. And we also just did some of the analysis to see whether management factors, protective management factors, would be associated with the herd prevalence. And these results were presented yesterday, and we see that animal movement, but also housing indoors, especially for dairy cattle, is a very protective management factor. Most of this also will be published, so you can read it yourself or just ask, and I will try to give you some of the links. Then, of course, vaccination, because that's something we were all, well, there's a lot to talk about. What we know from previous outbreaks is that vaccination is a really effective measure to eradicate a disease like this. So since May 2024, we have 3 vaccines available. After new regulations in the animal health law and a different Bluetongue is listed differently in the animal health law, it's now a voluntary vaccination strategy. And what we experience is that the willingness to vaccinate varies a lot, especially we see that farmers that experience the disease, they are very keen on vaccination, whereas people that were located, or farms located in lower prevalence areas, are less willing to vaccinate. But for sheep, we have a very high vaccination rate. To eradicate the disease, a high vaccination rate is necessary. So there's a lot of communication going on that, especially also to vaccinate dairy cattle, because they have a different, they have, the reservoir is not the right term to use, but they have a different function in the spread of the disease. But before May, there was a lot of going on, and especially because temperatures were going up in April, and people were getting anxious about the spread of the disease, because we have no idea whether the virus would overwinter and when it would start. However, compared to regions where BT is endemic, you would expect it's a disease from late summer or maybe autumn. So we did not expect the disease to appear before July. But the emotions were high. And that's the reason why we tried to tell people not to be anxious and do things they shouldn't. But in the meantime, Germany was developed an autologous vaccine, which could be made quite quick and would be available early. And because the Netherlands is very close to the German border, also Dutch veterinarians and farmers were keen on using that vaccine. However, we tried to prevent that, because in our opinion, an autologous vaccine with a disease like BT, it's a vector-borne disease. When things go wrong with a vaccine, it's out of your hands, it's out of control. You have no, because when it's picked up by the vector population, there's no way of controlling it anymore. So that's the reason why we hoped no one would be using it. And after using it, we saw that quite quick in Germany, the first cases of Bluetongue were detected and were related to the vaccine. So there was a vaccine that was, it was a live attenuated vaccine, but apparently not attenuated enough. So there was live virus in the vaccine with the effect of spreading. And we got some cases. So all these cases that German Germany appointed on the FLE side were PCR positive cases because of the vaccination. So that meant that, well, before this weekend, I have to say this was the situation in the Netherlands. We had a few cases with the PCR value under 25. And as you can see, these cases were close to the German border. Yeah, we suspect that this is the virus circulating from the autologous vaccine that's spreading, but we're not sure yet. We have to investigate at first. But until after this weekend, we got some alarming news, and we were called by several veterinarians and farmers, and a lot of farmers were notifying the disease again. But the worrying case in this is that all these farms declared that they had been vaccinating with one of the 3 vaccines early May, and these were the signs that were seen. So that means we have a very big problem at this moment, and we are now very keen on finding out what we are dealing with. Is it real? Is it again Bluetongue? Is it a different serotype Bluetongue? Is the vaccine working? Yes or no? A lot of things to find out. So that's really the situation we're in yet, and I think it's a very worrying situation. And I hope to give you more information as soon as possible, but we're still finding out at this moment. So this is the not so fortunate message I have to end this presentation with.
Thanks ever so much, Evelyn. Yeah, always sobering to hear those numbers about the Bluetongue. And yeah, really worrying about that very recent outbreak. So, I mean, that probably brings to head, we will be doing more webinars later in the summer as situations change probably. So just for you, sort of people signing in, watching this, just keep an eye out on the AHDB and the Ruminant Health and Welfare sort of social media things. We'll be advertising stuff. But yeah, and hopefully Evelyn and co will find out what's going on in Holland shortly. So wow, yeah, that is a concern. Right, I've actually got a couple of questions first while we wait for other questions. Got one for Marion first of all, because Gordon's had to shoot off. But in that modelling map, Marion, where you had the plumes coming over from coastal Europe, there were some from further north, sort of Netherlands and even into Germany part, that were coming across and getting halfway across the North Sea. Was that just them dying out, that sort of didn't cross the North Sea enough, or did the wind just stop blowing, or what happened there?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer, but I can find out for you. I think it may just be that the wind, yeah, sort of died down. So yeah, it wasn't strong enough, or it wasn't strong enough to actually go all the way. But just to say, we model them as particles, and we do take into account some sort of survival characteristics of the midge. But yeah, it's not, you know, we're modeling particles rather than really, you know, modeling an exact replica of what the midge would be doing.
Great.
Joe,
Thanks
just
very
to
much.
say I am still here. I do need to go in 5 to 10 minutes though.
Ah, brilliant. That's marvellous news. Thank you, Gordon. I thought you probably had to shoot off. So any questions for Gordon? And then I've got one for Evelyn about the outbreak. Earlier in the outbreak, the clinical signs were worse, the mortality was worse, as it were. Could you just go into more detail why you think those early cases were worse, if you're able to, please?
Yeah, we're not quite sure, but we think that these farms were experienced under a much higher infectious load compared to farms where in the end of the outbreak. So these farms were experienced from September till end of October or start November. So they have a long time to be infected, but also maybe that there is also the more you are what's it called, stung by the culicoides and infected with virus, so you have a higher viral load. It might also have an effect. We think that it also will have an effect on the way the disease presents itself.
Great. So do you think, and maybe Marion come on this, do you think that the midges, the animals earlier were bitten by more infected midges, or do you think that the midges actually had higher levels of virus in their salivary glands because it was warmer and so it had replicated more?
So, I mean, what we've been seeing in our so we've done a study looking at BTV-3 in sheep, and we found that one animal was infected with very few bites, and it still presented a fully disseminated infection. So it's interesting that Evelyn is saying they may be observing something different. But our studies have shown that, and previous studies with other strains have shown that you only need one bite for a full infection to present. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's sort of not. So it could be multiple midges giving more virus, perhaps. Yeah. Or maybe don't.
Yeah. I mean, from our studies, we haven't seen that, but perhaps it may be different in the Netherlands and in the field. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those things that, like, the force of infection is driven by temperature. It could be to do with, I mean, I think as Evelyn says, we don't really know. Is the answer. It's kind of hypotheses at the moment as to, why some animals present more severely than others. I mean, there is a lot of individual variation. So again, within the studies that we've conducted, we have one animal that wasn't sick at all. Our control animal was fine, obviously, and then 4 other animals presented with full infections and one didn't. And yet they were all sourced from the same place. They were identical breeds. They would have been very genetically similar, but just individual variation in their immune systems could cause different clinical presentation.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Right, we'll go to these questions there. We've got one. How can we best keep up to date with the situation in the Netherlands? I suppose the Netherlands will be reporting, and then that'll come across to Gordon and stuff, and it'll be on newsletters and social media channels and the farming press and the veterinary press and such like that. I don't know if Hannah wants to add anything to that, or Evelyn or Gordon. Or
yeah, I think you can, according to the notifications, they are best to follow on the website of the or Food and Safety Authority, because they will make the maps, and they will update them every day. I think the website of the FLE will also give an accurate update. And on the website of Royal GD, we will give we will give information on what we find, but it won't be an actual accurate update on the amount of notifications. So, but that's for the Dutch situations. I think those are the two websites you should keep in mind.
I mean, I think, from a Defra perspective, we do appreciate how open and sharing Dutch colleagues have been in this. And, there's a couple of days lag, but, that's nothing in the big picture. And the website is very, very good. If you want to sort of look at that holistic picture, Marion spoke about, the temperature monitoring, the wind monitoring, etc. We are publishing those weekly assessments. They'll obviously be looking back at the previous 2 weeks, so it's not a forecasting thing, but they do reflect, disease activity in the continent, and that will affect which of those counties are high risk. So at the moment, we're saying that those eastern counties are at the highest risk because, it looks like if there is disease present, it's in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. If it goes down into France, for example, then that brings in the southern counties, and they may become higher risk. So, watch the Gov.uk interactive map, which shows the high risk areas. Look at those weekly assessments. And obviously, if we are getting worried, we'll be proactively pushing out social media and text alerts, and speaking to Joe, speaking to Ruminant Health and Welfare, speaking to the vets, etc., to raise that awareness. So I assure you, as soon as we know, we'll be on the case.
Thanks, Gordon. That's great. Question about the working with the abattoirs, how to get data. Basically, I think as the customers of the abattoirs, people sending them stock, should just be asking the abattoirs to start the process. There's forms to fill and boxes to tick, and sometimes structural changes to make, and it's not instant. So sort of the sooner they get on having conversations with the abattoirs that aren't yet designated, that means that if and when we do get any restrictions and cases in the UK, then we're more ready and the trade won't be interrupted, which is obviously pretty important. Question here for Emma, for the new cases to get serotyped, how long do you think that'll take?
I expect we know today or tomorrow.
Right, great, okay, that's pretty swift then. And regarding the edema around the throat and the respiratory distress, so I'm just going to read this. Were these animals vaccinated? Which I think you said they were, and but they were vaccinated back in May, so it can't be a vaccine reaction, can it?
No.
Yeah, so that's pretty worrying, really.
The respiratory distress is mainly caused because severe lung edema.
Right.
And there's a swelling of the tongue, and we also see a swelling of the mucosa of the palatum. Because of the vasculitis, everything is swelling, so there's fluid on everywhere. There shouldn't be fluid. So these animals, they drown in their own fluid.
And were these animals, there's a question here, were these all on one farm or in several locations?
Several locations. So we had since Monday, the phone was alarming. I think we have around 50 cases since Monday.
Wow, on several premises. Yeah.
Yes. mostly on the eastern part of the Netherlands, and also in areas that did not experience Bluetongue during the previous outbreak.
Near to where the German vaccine was used, or
Yeah, so when you look at the figure of the FLE with the I'm not sure if I can. So here you can see and these the PCR positives close to the Dutch border, and that's also exactly where we see our new cases.
right? Right, very interesting. Do we think that the long season? Let's just read this question. Do you think the long seasonality, low temperatures, northerly wind directions in the UK and northwest Europe? I think yes. Basically, it's been a rubbish summer. It's not been very warm, with a lot of northerly winds, which I can fully vouch for. Do you think that's reduced transmission so far in Holland? And if you don't get a grip, it might be worse in 25. I don't know.
Well, to be honest, we wouldn't have expected it already circulating that much before July. We would experience, well, maybe 1 or 2 cases, or you would expect most cases around August, because you have the factor populations to be reinfected again, and then before it can actually start spreading. But I think, because of the introduction of virus already early in the season, in Germany it might have started earlier than we would expect.
Right. I mean, certainly from Marion's graph there, the warmer it is, the quicker they replicate, and the happier the virus is. You know, it is an African virus, isn't it? So I suspect that the fact we're sitting here in 13 degrees in Northumberland, you know, and it's quite cool, probably a good thing from this point of view anyway. Right, one more question. Thanks for the very good session. I just want to know how the potential vaccine-associated infections will affect vaccine hesitancy. I think my take on that is basically because that is an autogenous vaccine, that was the problem. And the 3 others that you've been using in the Netherlands are all non-autogenous vaccines, so that risk is far, far lower, and it's just a question of making a real distinction between not a homemade vaccine, but you know, nearer to a homemade vaccine, autogenous one, compared to one that's gone through big pharma. Is that right, Evelyn? Would you or Gordon comment on that?
I don't know if Evelyn wants. So, so obviously we're talking to the vaccine manufacturers. The 3 that Dutch colleagues have approved for use, we're also talking to those companies, and they are based on their existing BTV 1, 4, and 8 strain. So it's different. It's not an autogenous vaccine, and it's a properly inactivated vaccine as opposed to a attenuated live vaccine. So they are a very different thing. I mean, obviously what Evelyn's been saying, in that perhaps against this, whatever's happening, it hasn't been as effective as we would have expected. We need to look at that, and whether that's across all 3 vaccines or whether it's just one of them. And obviously there's a lot of sensitivity and commercial activity in that. So I don't think we should speculate on that until we know what in strain it is. It could be BTV8 for all we know, or 4, or something daft that's come in. So let's not speculate on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gordon. And I think, essentially everything we know about Bluetongue, vaccination is the only way out of this disease, really. It was in 2008, 2009, with the BTV8. But obviously we need to get that is the tricky thing. And I think obviously everyone was really worried, and that's why they were getting us, getting very keen to try any sort of vaccine, and it just shows the risks with sometimes if the vaccines haven't gone through enough checks and such like.
Apologies, I really must go now. And thanks for the invite, and thanks again, Marion and Evelyn in particular for being so open with the emerging situation. It is much appreciated. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks for coming along. That's brilliant. Right, I think that's. But why was that? Yeah, I think we've probably answered that question anyway. People are just desperate for vaccines of any sort, I think. Right, well, I'll just check if we've got any more because we're coming to the end anyway. Yeah, so we should find out in the next few days. Right. Great. Okay, I think unless we get many more questions, we'll bring that to a close. It's been really interesting as ever, but actually slightly more worrying than I thought it would be with that recent update. And we'll see whether we've got something else on the go or whether the picture's more complicated than we thought. I had one more question, probably from Evelyn. You said that housing for the dairy cattle was one of the best ways of reducing their chance of getting bitten there. Was that how in your presentation, was that housing with the fans or just any sort of putting them in a shed? Or did you not make that distinction? Or if you could expand on that, please.
Especially housing with good ventilation has a protective association on herd prevalence, what we found in our studies.
Yeah, with ventilation, like mechanical ventilation with fans.
Mechanical,
yeah.
Also, whether there was open stables. So I'm not sure how it's in the certain use of gas in front of the windows.
Yeah. Right. Great. No, that's good. And the Dutch farm. So the vaccine. You say the good uptake amongst the sheep farmers, but a bit less amongst because there's not many beef farmers, is there? So most of the cattle are dairy cattle in Holland, in the Netherlands rather. But the rates of vaccination, as it were, are lower in the dairy cattle. Is that like looking to increase as the summer goes on, or is most of the vaccinating being done, or where are you at in that?
Well, it differs a lot per region, and especially what the emotion is for farmers, especially when they experience the disease, they don't want to experience it again, so they are very highly motivated on vaccination. But in regions where they did not experience Bluetongue, it's not really in their mind, and they're way less motivated to vaccinate. For cattle, we can control the vaccination rates better because you have to assign whether you or register your vaccinations. Whereas for sheep, it's not obligatory to register your vaccine. So for sheep, it's harder to tell whether the vaccination rates are high. But what we heard from veterinarians as sheep farmers is that most sheep farmers, especially larger flocks, are less motivated to vaccinate, and that's because of a cost perspective. But most of the sheep farms are motivated for vaccination.
Yeah, I would think of that sort of large mortality. Just had one more question come in. In the farms that have been infected post-vaccination, those 50 cases that you're talking about, was it the same vaccine used or a mix of all three, or do you know that yet?
No, we haven't cleared what they used yet. So that's something we have to figure out now, and to make sure we do proper interviews on these farms to see what happened. So yeah, we hope to find, or something we have to find out. So that's what we're working on right now, to get a better picture of what's going on.
And we'll just hear from you in due course. Brilliant. Okay, if there's not going to be any more questions, I think we'll probably wrap that up. I mean, thanks ever so much for your time, Marion and Evelyn. I know you're really busy, and you'll certainly have loads on at the moment, and the phone will be ringing off the hook. So we're really grateful you could spare the time to tell us what's been going on. So thanks ever so much for that. As I say, for everyone sort of listening in, just keep your eye on websites and social media posts, and there might well be more webinars as situations change. And it sounds like there's definitely going to be more information coming out in the reasonably near future from the Netherlands about these latest cases. Okay, thanks very much, and it's been great having you here.
Okay.